Good evening, everybody. My name is Yvonne Phyllis. I'm the co-director of operations here at the Forge, and I'd like to welcome everyone who's here and also everyone joining us through the virtual platforms, which is through our YouTube channel. Tonight, we are launching the book Nation on the Couch, Inside South Africa's Mind by Wahbie Long. This is a collaboration between The Forge and Melinda Ferguson Books. The author tonight, Wahbie Long, will be in conversation with Danielle Bowler, whom we affectionately know as Danny. But tonight, the publisher, Melinda Ferguson, is going to introduce our two wonderful speakers. What I am going to do is introduce The Forge, so talk a little bit about what the Forge mandate is and what the Forge as the space is. So the Forge is driven by a mandate to specifically engage progressive Pan-African ideas and to engage radical ideas more broadly, and on a specific and on a especially internationalist basis. This includes anti-racism, feminism, anti-xenophobia, issues pertaining to sexuality, anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, and crucially, the lived experiences and struggles of working class and impoverished people. Engaging with these ideas, we hope to do this work in a way that includes historical struggles and theory, contemporary issues and struggles, as they unfold at the local, regional, and international levels, and theory emerging from and in conversation with these struggles. And now we'll talk a little bit about what the Forge space is here for in the world. The Forge is a space for the expression and discussion of ideas. It is a space for new encounters, and it is a space for the development of solidarities. And here at the Forge, we understand work to be a number of things. Work can be discussions, talks. Work can be all kinds of cultural work, music, dance, poetry, and what we're doing tonight, a book launch. So that is what the Forge is here for. The Forge is on 87 Dakote Street in Braamfontein, and it is a space available to the community who's doing work which is related or similar to our broad mandate. So now I'll hand over to the publisher, Melinda Ferguson. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. Phew, feels like we're on a big stage with lots of bright lights. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. It's not easy at the moment for people. I think this pandemic has really taken all of us for I don't even know what the word is, but we're basically beholden to a whole lot of things at the moment that make it difficult, I think, to move and to risk. And so those of you who've come tonight, thank you, thank you. And for those of you who are joining us on YouTube, welcome. I hope you're comfortable. You're probably having a nice glass of wine. Let me just talk a bit about publishing at the moment. It's very challenging. The lockdown has created a big vacuum, in a sense, in terms of people's safety and how they believe their safety is. And going into bookshops, going out the way that we used to, has become a lot more challenging. So as a publisher, my whole way of publishing had to kind of change last year very suddenly when I realized that things were not going to be the way that they were before. And the last year has been a lot about adapting and about trying to find material that is relevant to the nation. So when Wahbie Long, and he is a professor, by the way, he doesn't like to be called that, but I do like to say Professor Wahbie Long. When, in fact, Richard Pitthouse, the editor-in-chief of New Frame, so there's a lovely connection here tonight, he approached me and introduced me to Wahbie Long. told me Wahbie had written an amazing book, and I do take Richard's opinion really seriously, so I was immediately interested. I get about 100 submissions a month. I can't always read everything because it takes a long time to read a book. But I looked at the first few chapters of Wahbie's proposal and the actual submission, and it was kind of word perfect. I don't often get a manuscript that's just, not just word perfect, but insightful, groundbreaking, so important. So I just felt very privileged when I reached out to Wahbie and said, I'd like to be your publisher, and Wahbie said yes. So Nation on the Couch, Inside South Africa's Mind, was born in, I think it was April, Wahbie. And it feels like it's been going on for quite a while. The book has gained a lot of traction in the media. There have been amazing conversations. And when I had to choose a person to be in conversation with Wahbie Long, I could think of no one better than Danielle Bowler, otherwise known as Danny, who, by the way, is also writing a book for me. She just doesn't know that she has to submit it one of these days. But Danielle's mind has always intrigued me. I love the way she thinks. She's the culture editor at New Frame. Wahbie is the associate professor of psychology at UCT. So we've got a beautiful Cape Town, Joburg little thing happening tonight. I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm a very, very proud woman tonight. I love this book. If you're watching, if you haven't read it, people here, it's one of those books that are like manna for the mind. A true kind of experience of elucidation, of brain food. And having a book like this on my list is a great privilege. Wahbie has been longlisted for the Sunday Times CNA Award. I think this is a book that every South African should read, and I really hope people are going to. So, enjoy your conversation, and thank you for agreeing to do this.
Thanks so much, Melinda. Thank you to everybody who has come out. As have not. Thank you. Let's try that again. Thank you, everyone, for coming out, and thank you to everybody who has tuned in to the live stream. As Yvonne and Melinda have generously noted, my name is Danielle Bowler, and I have the privilege of being in conversation with Wahbie about this book that I think, after reading it, I would describe as fascinating and provocative in every sense of the word, and something that is ripe for discourse and for conversation. So I'm looking forward to our conversation, and really, I think we can sum up this book as something that tries to take us into our national consciousness, into our group mind, and the idea of a collective unconscious is something that I'd really like to delve into more. But I think that there's a quote from the book that kind of encapsulates the aim of the book, which says, "Through a systematic, unflinching emptying of our most tortured minds, we can begin to comprehend the depths of an enduring national tragedy." And that sense of plumbing the depths of an unconscious as a nation, I think that is something that's valuable for thinking about the many different kinds of violences that occur daily in the South African landscape. And we're not speaking about violence as something that is primarily physical and enacted in that way, but the violence of things like poverty, the violence of things like GBV, the many different textures of violence that have become part of the everyday. But I'd like to start just with a question that has interested me in reading this. What drew you to the field of psychoanalysis?
Sure. Well, Danny, if I think about my background in psychology, the one thing that I realized was that psychology and psychoanalysis are quite different. I think there is a tendency to conflate the two, to treat them as equal, but psychoanalysis is something quite distinct. intellectually, but also practically from psychology. I'm not a psychoanalyst. I'm a clinical psychologist, but I have a deep and abiding interest in psychoanalytic theory. Now, I think psychology, generally speaking, politically speaking at least, has been a fairly conservative discipline across time, across place. That's not to say that there haven't been revolutionary strands within psychology, such as in Latin America, when one thinks of liberation social psychology, for example. But by and large, it's been a discipline for followers, actually. Psychology has tended to follow power rather than to lead it. Now, psychoanalysis also has a bit of a checkered history. One tends to think of psychoanalysis as being a very highbrow, elitist, and conservative pursuit. But as I got into the history of psychoanalysis, I was very inspired by what I found. There is a very easy sort of depiction of Freud as a political conservative. But actually, when one looks at Freud's work, it's very difficult to pin him down politically, where on the spectrum he is. And when one looks at the second generation of psychoanalysts in particular, one sees that, in fact, they were quite a radical bunch. They were anarchists, social democrats, communists, socialists. Then World War II happened. World War II happened. Many of that generation of analysts were Jewish. They fled across the Atlantic to the States. The States was a place that did not like Jews, that did not like communists. And so what happened was those radical analysts gradually accommodated themselves to the ideological atmosphere of post-war United States of America. But I was always inspired by their radical understanding of psychoanalysis. And so when I came to write this book, I thought to myself that psychoanalytic theory is the way to go to understand the social issues of South Africa in a politically progressive, if not radical way. Psychoanalysis, sure, it's got a bad reputation as being politically center, if not right. But there are enough resources, theoretical resources within psychoanalytic theory, I think, that can actually drive a very progressive, radical understanding of social issues in South Africa from a psychoanalytic perspective.
And I think what I found really fascinating within the book is your repeated return to questioning both fields and to questioning psychoanalytic theory and even the practice of what that means on the couch, and questioning the dominant modes in which that has occurred, because you speak about the fact that the psychological and the social have been separated, as much as you speak later on about the mind and matter have been separated. And I found that idea interesting, of thinking about, even within the framework of understanding South Africa, not separating the psychological and the social or collapsing them, but working with a connection between the two. Because you say in the book, separation obfuscates what's happening in South Africa. And I'd like you to speak a little bit more about that, because you go into the fact that psychological theories look more at the idea of personal history. And that's kind of, I would think, the kind of pop psychology idea of I'm going to be on a couch and speak about my family and my dad and my mom and things that happened to me, as opposed to being on the couch as someone who has a specific class position, a specific race, a specific sexuality, that all bear on who I am and the reason that I'm on the couch in that first place.
So, Danny, that distinction between the psychological and the social is such an important one to interrogate, because it's a divide, I think, that has really harmed well, not just psychology but psychoanalytic practice, because what it's meant is that as you're alluding to, politics has been left out of the consulting room. Markers like race, gender, sexuality, and class get treated as typically as demographic information and as nothing more. And yet, particularly in a country like South Africa, surely our lived experiences are inflected, are imbued in powerful ways with racialized, gendered, classed experiences, and that for me is something. Those experiences simply have to be brought into the consulting room. Otherwise, that divide between the psychological and the social just kept, it is kept in place, and so what happens is, in my view, the patient's experience does in therapy or in analysis does not reflect the richness of their lived experience. And of course, if you keep politics out of the room, you're very clearly taking a political position. The politics of no politics is a political position.
And I'd like you to speak more to that, because you were talking earlier about what it means then, given the histories of this practice, this discipline, these theories. Given that history, taking that into account, thinking that through, I mean, you referred to more modern theories as well as really classical theories in the book. But in this particular book, thinking about what it means to approach these questions in a radical and progressive way, given that, what does that mean to you as a writer and as a thinker?
Just drawing back, doubling back to that psychosocial divide, I think what's so important for me as a writer, but also as a practitioner, is to always keep in mind that human beings are relational beings. That word relational is used so easily nowadays, and yet we don't, I think, do justice to what the implications are of saying that we are relational, fundamentally social and relational beings. And within psychoanalytic theory, more recently, the relational school, the intersubjective school, I think recognizes that fact, and it's in those schools, understandably, that therefore conversations in psychotherapy, in psychoanalysis, become much more open to talking about race, about gender, about class, and so, because there's this understanding that we are not these self-contained, atomized beings, but that in fact we are constantly implicated in the lives of others, in the lives of, and not just with people, but with institutions, with discourses, with symbols. There is this constant toing and froing between us as individuals and the structures that surround us. So it does mean that it did mean that when I wrote this book, I had to take a lot more into consideration. I couldn't do the usual thing and just treat human beings as self-contained individuals. I had to constantly keep in mind the fact that we are social creatures, we are political creatures, even though that might not be the dominant understanding within psychoanalytic psychotherapy today.
I find that really interesting, because the idea of the relational dimension or a lack of a psychosocial divide seems, given today's discourses and the way that we think about human beings, to be fairly obvious. But it's interesting that the dominant kind of psychological thought is wrestling with that idea. But I love that you took us to relatedness, which is really where I wanted to go next, because that feels really like the underpinning of the book, this idea of, if human beings are fundamentally in a situation of relational contact, relational understanding, what does then misrecognition mean? What does disrespect mean? And what do kind of your three emotional tones that you go into, shame, envy, impasse, mean? But you go into this idea in the book, which really, I think, is at the heart of the book, this idea of alienation, which you point to is something that can mean everything, but has a very specific meaning here as a relational idea. And what I found fascinating was that we do conceive of alienation as a lack of relation, so that there's no relation in it at all. It's a negative. But you, through the work of someone that you mentioned, yes,
Jaggy.
Speak about the idea that alienation is a relation. It's a relation of relationlessness. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, that's really key, Danny, because the everyday understanding of alienation is that it means I don't have a relationship with something. I'm alienated from my work. I'm alienated from my family. I'm alienated from my university. I don't have a relationship with any of these things. But I try to make a point in the book of stressing that the idea of alienation is not about it's not about not having a relationship with something. There is a relationship with something, but it's a distorted relationship. It's, as you put it, a relation of relationlessness. And the idea of alienation is something, it's really theoretically the golden thread, I think, that runs through the whole book, once again stressing how we are relational beings. And when that relationality, if you will, becomes distorted, then alienation kicks in. The other point I make about alienation is that it's not, I don't mean it primarily as a feeling state. People typically say, you know, when I'm alienated, that they feel alienated. And I argue that yes, alienation can be seen as a relation of relationlessness with yourself or with other people. But alienation is also written into our relationships with, for example, institutions, with places of work, I used the example of universities earlier. So alienation, it's not this private thing, this private feeling inside of us. It's written into the structure of the world and how we relate to the world, quite apart from being written into how we relate to ourselves and to the people around us. So it's really everywhere.
And that takes me in two directions. One, that I found really fascinating in the book is that there is a really damning critique of capitalism and how it's contributed to all of this, to relationlessness, to the cultivation of shame, to kind of the master-slave dialectic, to the realities that we live with today. And I found this interesting because I've never read a kind of psychoanalytic or psychological theory that takes this deeply into account in thinking about the effect of capitalism on our psyches, which I'm starting to see more and more in just commonplace discussions.
You know, whenever one has to talk about Marxism, one usually has to preface it with an apology. But when it comes to the case of capitalism, in my view, there is no better critique of capitalism than Marxism. Marx really speaks powerfully, writes powerfully about how capitalism disrupts our relationships with the world, with ourselves, with the people around us. And look, that's not to say that I'm suggesting that we need to bring back Soviet-style what. What's the big difference between socialism and or communism and capitalism? Well, with capitalism, you've got people exploiting people, and with communism, it's the other way around. So it's just a matter of there is no easy answer for how we deal with the disfigurement, I think, of the human psyche and human relations that arises out of a capitalist mode of production. There are no easy answers. But the one thing that I do make clear in the book is that the Marxist critique of capitalism, particularly through the idea of alienation, still resonates with our times.
And there was a point in the book that towards the end, when you're starting to speak about hope as an idea, where you're talking about the idea that we proceed from the heavens to the earth, the idea that it is I think, therefore I am, which we're all very familiar with, and where you insist instead on more Marxist understanding that, I think you say here, the conditions of the material world determine all else. So real world life determines thoughts and the development of ideologies, etc. But there was a really nice quote in that where you were saying, it is not consciousness that determines life, but life that determines consciousness. And I think that that's a really interesting and different idea, that thoughts originate in our material conditions.
Yeah, and again, that's classic Marx. Within psychology and indeed within psychoanalytic theory, there can be a tendency to think of the mind as some abstract thing. And yet the argument that Marx, among others, makes, and indeed the early Freud made, is that the mind is a material thing. And I don't mean just in a neuropsychological sense, that the mind has neuropsychological correlates in the brain. I mean it in the sense that, as you put it, our consciousness is a product of our everyday experiences, our everyday social and material experiences. And so the mind, or the mental, if you like, is rooted in the material. And that is one of the hardest things, I think, that people can be asked to accept, because the tendency is to think of the mind as an abstract thing, and that therefore the material doesn't matter. The mind is just the mind, and despite whatever your circumstances, if you just try hard enough, then it's a case of mind over matter, which of course is a highly ideological thing. Mind is not just over matter. Mind is determined by matter. So how do we then say you just have to exercise your mind over matter and you can change your circumstances?
Yeah, and I think that has such deep resonance with the idea of bootstrapping, the idea that you can think yourself out of conditions, the idea that you can imagine your life better and just work towards it, as if there's no kind of socioeconomic and other aspects of life to consider. So I think that's a really valuable idea that you center in the book. But I want to take us more into the material. So in the book, you're speaking about South Africa having this subterraneous life, and South Africans as citizens having a shared psychic life or group psychology, which seemed to me to be a really radical idea. The idea of a group amongst very different people, and people who have been kept in very different places, separated through every form of life, and as having this shared psychic life, which I love that you use the example of a football match, because I think that makes it very easy to understand that sense that when we all go to kind of a football match or a concert, there is this kind of group feeling that we can all tap into that seems kind of inexplicable. But what you are trying to understand in this book is something deeper, something more textured. And the idea of how do we understand what motivates, moves, and is beneath our behaviors and actions and thoughts, and unconscious as South Africans. Can you talk me through that idea that just as individuals have an unconscious, as citizens we have an unconscious?
Yeah, so that's the idea of the political unconscious. Most people, well, many people who are familiar with psychology and psychoanalysis will know about the idea of an individual unconscious. That if one thinks of, let's just use Freud's example, if one thinks of the mind as an iceberg, the conscious mind is that little bit of the iceberg sticking out above the water, but the unconscious mind and the preconscious is where all the action is. And that's the larger part of the iceberg, which is completely submerged and which is outside of our conscious awareness, and depending on how you understand the unconscious, could be completely inaccessible, irretrievable. So that's the Freudian idea of an individual unconscious. One moves across to someone like Jung then, who talks about a collective unconscious, that the collective unconscious is sort of like a storeroom for universal human symbols, like, you know, Mother Earth, or the trickster. These archetypes that characterize universal psychological life, if you will. I'm sort of now moving beyond the collective unconscious to this idea of a political unconscious, which, let me just say at the outset, is not a phrase that I invented. The idea of a political unconscious is something that goes back at least as far back as the 1980s. The literary theorist Frederick Jameson, he wrote a book called The Political Unconscious. And more recently, analysts have written about the idea of a political psyche or a political self. So what I mean by a political unconscious is just the idea that just as individuals have unconscious minds, groups, collectives, nations can also be said to have unconscious minds. And as you said, it is a radical idea, particularly in a country as divided as South Africa is. The structure of the book, I think, affirms this, where it moves from the chapter on shame to envy to impasse, where it's looking really at different groups within the South African nation, the poor and working classes, the rising black middle class, white people in South Africa. So the structure of the book affirms that there are these deep fractures within the nation, and so therefore, psychologically speaking, these different groups in South African life are grappling with different psychological issues. But that's not to say that there isn't something tying it all together. There might be, if you like, different regions of the political unconscious that resonate differently for different groups in South Africa. But the one, I suppose, state that ties it all together, that for me makes it that for me legitimizes the idea of a political unconscious for the South African nation, is the idea of alienation. The idea that what unites us all, what relates us all, if you like, to each other, is this relationlessness. That's the paradox. What unites this nation, psychologically speaking, is alienation. So that really is what I mean by a political unconscious. Now, when things become unconscious, what one's talking about is one encounters problems that just cannot be solved. And because these problems are unsolvable, they get repressed. They get pushed into this nether region, the unconscious, or for our purposes, the political unconscious. But it doesn't go away. What happens in the South African instance is we become a symptomatic population. We show symptoms of that I think reveal what lies beneath, if you will. We show symptoms that tell us what the contents of that political unconscious might be. And of course, the book is very much, as you put it, it's really a book about violence in all aspects, whether it's interpersonal, whether it's gender-based, whether it's institutional, structural, symbolic. It's a book about violence. And I suppose what I'm not always explicitly stating in the book is that the unconscious life of the South African nation is a life of trauma. It's a life of trauma, unresolved trauma, that then pops up symptomatically what Freud would call the return of the repressed. What pops up symptomatically in these acts of astounding violence, whether we're talking about symbolic violence, gender-based violence, racial violence, and then of course the South African population is, one sees the headlines all the time, how senseless this violence, and it's only senseless because...
That's exactly where I wanted to go, because
Yeah.
you speak about that sense of, you know, when we speak about violence, we're often talking about inexplicable, senseless. We use words that make it seem like it's absolutely beyond comprehension, but you posit that it's precisely that senselessness that is its sense.
It's only senseless violence because we're not sure how to read the political unconscious. But the minute one starts to use theory to try and understand what might be going on in the political unconscious, then it's not very senseless anymore. Then actually, psychoanalytically speaking, it makes a good deal of sense. Why we have these, for example, astounding levels of interpersonal violence. If one is able to accept the idea of an unconscious, and a political unconscious specifically, then it becomes possible to explain and understand the social problems that bear down on us from every direction. Now, maybe it's also worth saying, Danny, that the idea of an unconscious is not an idea that is easily embraced. I think we live in hyper rational times where we imagine that we're in full control. We are intentional beings. We know exactly why we do what we do. We live our lives consciously. We've got a plan, and we're goal directed, and we'll get there. What's less easy to accept is that actually there's a lot going on that we just don't know about, that's tripping us up all the time. And the only way you can make sense of that is if you're willing to concede that there's some stuff we don't know about ourselves, individually and it's a humbling thought. It's a humbling thought, the idea that, you know what, I don't have all the answers, that there's stuff going on underwater that I actually am clueless about. Yeah.
I giggle because I think that's like, as someone who is in therapy, that is always what I find fascinating, that idea that you can not know yourself. When it seems like you would be the person most well placed to know yourself completely.
And the idea of the unconscious basically is assuming that we are all self-deceiving beings. You know, that is our nature. Our nature is to deceive ourselves. We imagine that we have the answers. We imagine that we understand ourselves, but actually there's so much going on that we're just completely in the dark about.
But at the same time, I mean, there's a sense of sometimes, can we ever attribute too much to an unconscious? You know, that sense of, you know, if I walk in with a black shirt and you say, okay, that was interesting that you chose the black shirt today, you know, could you have chosen the yellow shirt? And I'm like, you know what, the black one was clean. It wasn't an intentional choice. And that's just like my own giggle about psychoanalysis, is that it can seem to go too far, but then someone can say to you, well, I'm sure there were other clean ones, but the black one was really fascinating to you today. But I think that this idea of the political unconscious is a really fascinating one. And like you say, the book is primarily a book that's trying to think through different forms of everyday, consistent, apparently banal and senseless violence, and you trying to make sense of it all. But I think there's something interesting in that towards the end of the chapter on shame, you speak about the fact that you don't want the book to be an apology for violence. It's simply something that's trying to say that history matters.
I do worry that this book could be easily misunderstood. I try as far as possible not to make moral arguments but to suspend judgment in the interests of understanding violence. And ideologically, the book is hard to place. I can imagine readers going from chapter to chapter and wondering, where on the spectrum is this guy? Is he left? Is he center? Is he on the right? Where what's going on here? And I can imagine that. I can imagine that for some, they would want to short circuit that kind of discomfort about the apparently inconsistent ideology of the book and say, okay, I'm pigeonholing this book as there on the spectrum, and that's the end of it. I mean, my hope is really that readers will tolerate the uncertainty, the ambiguity, as they move from chapter to chapter. And maybe I can just say that the reason why the book appears ideologically inconsistent is because I'm trying to deal with issues on their own terms, rather than to come at every single social issue from a particular ideological perspective. Because I do think that, I mean, for one, it's polarizing, and two, we've got to look at issues as independently as we can, and to try and see what explains a given issue best, as opposed to trying to insist on a particular ideological position explaining every single social issue in the country.
And I think that the thing that struck me about the book is it feels curious, intellectually very curious, that you're willing to go to spaces that the material seems to want to go to and the research seems to want to go to. And I think in reading it, that sense of where do you lie on this political spectrum, or what is the ideological underpinning of the book, is something that, to use the terms of the book itself, invites relation, invites some kind of relation to the material and dialogue with, that even the material itself is trying to say that there's a situation of relatedness that is required in order to make this book make sense. I don't know if that even makes sense.
Yeah, that one's got to engage with this material with a spirit of curiosity. I think that's absolutely crucial to get the most out of the book, if you will, because I don't think anyone can read this book from cover to cover and be happy. There will be some chapters. There will be some chapters, I think, where readers will say, "Yes, this is absolutely right. I love this stuff," and then they'll read another chapter and they say, "Got it all wrong. Don't know what he's talking about. It's complete nonsense." And my comeback to that would just be, well, when if you go to your psychologist to only hear nice things about yourself, then you don't need a psychologist. You need a friend. A psychologist is going to tell you what the things that are the hardest for you to believe about yourself. And if that is the experience of the reader as they're moving through the book, then I think the book's doing its job.
There was one of the shouts that was really, really interesting to me. I think it was the one by Sarah Nuttall at Wiser. And what was interesting was that sense of her saying that you diagnose contemporary South Africa with an explanatory depth that most analysis resist. As with any diagnosis of a troubled state, it's at times difficult to hear, yet it carries the release that comes with understanding as if for the first time. And for me, that sense, I kept returning to that as something playing on my mind, like how do we sit with even the discomfort of thought as writers, as thinkers, and reckon with what that means to be intellectually curious. But I want to ask you were speaking earlier about the fact that even the book's structure alludes to this dichotomized or the separated existence, separated psychic states. How did you arrive at these emotional tones, at looking at the ideas of shame, of envy, of impasse?
Essentially what I did was I looked at what I see as the biggest problems in our country. and obviously everybody's got their list, their preferred catalog. But for me, it's really the three biggest problems are violence and interpersonal violence specifically, inclusive of gender-based violence, inequality, and racism. And I sort of worked backwards from there. I tried to understand what is the psychology of violence. What is what are the psychological fallouts of inequality? How do we explain white racism? And beginning with those social problems, I then started moving through psychoanalytic theory and trying to account for those problems from a psychological perspective. And ultimately those were the emotional states that I came upon. The idea of shame as a major driver for interpersonal violence, that when someone feels shamed, it makes psychological sense to divest oneself, to rid oneself of that shame and project it onto another group, typically a marginalized group, an already oppressed group, whether one's talking about women, children, or refugees, and then to essentially destroy, or at least try to destroy that group that now carries your shame as a perpetrator. So that was my understanding of how we might understand interpersonal violence. The problem of inequality, when one looks at unequal societies, particularly in capitalist societies, it doesn't take much to realize that in those societies there is this pervasive ethic of social comparison. One hears that phrase, keeping up with the Joneses.
Thought you were going to say Kardashians.
Keeping up with the Kardashians. And this ethic of social comparison that is endemic in capitalist societies. And so it's understandable in a country as unequal as ours, that envy, and again, I don't mean it in a pejorative or a moralizing or an infantilizing sense, that envy must take hold in that kind of society. It's one thing, absolute poverty is one thing where everybody's in the same boat. But relative poverty, when, there's a phrase I have in the book where I say, the injustice of inequality is not that one lives in a shack, but that the shack sits in the shadow of a palace. Relative inequality is incredibly destructive, psychologically as well, because it just breeds a very destructive kind of envy. And then as far as racism or racial ambivalence goes, with many white South Africans, the argument I make there is that post-1994 and the coming in of the democratic dispensation, what's happened is for many white South Africans, they no longer know what their place in this country is. There was a master-slave dialectic that structured this country for hundreds of years, and suddenly, with the dismantling of apartheid, it raised it generated, I argue in the book, an existential impasse for many white South Africans who now struggle to insert or understand their place in South African life now. So that really was how I worked out the different emotions: shame, envy, and impasse. And Danny, again, maybe I can just say that I treat emotions in the book not as private experiences.
I think that's an important thing because, just like alienation, emotion means something very particular in this book. Please expand on that.
So emotions etymologically, according to the Latin, ex movere, emotion means it's in motion. It's moving outwards. It's moving between people. Emotions are relational things that animate our relationships with each other, and that's a line I push consistently throughout the book, whether I'm talking about shame or envy or impasse or indeed hope. The the insistence in my argument is that we're not talking about private experiences inside people's heads, emotional experiences. We're talking about a shared emotional life that is bouncing off us and between us all the time.
And I think that distinction allows us to understand emotions as something relational.
Exactly.
And not as my own feelings that exist for me in my own life. But I want to ask a question that I was thinking about as a writer and as someone who has to think through very challenging questions. What was the most challenging part of writing this book?
I think the hardest part was the chapter on hope. The chapter on hope. I think the question of hope is something that concerned South African citizens worry about all the time, really. Where is this country going? Do we have something to be hopeful about? And as I was writing this book, at the back of my mind, I knew I'm going to have to come to this emotion, this social emotion of hope. And I didn't know the answer as I was writing the book, but it was as I was immersing myself in the material, and then eventually coming out at this chapter on hope, that I was able to answer the question for myself, and that was the hardest part. Answering the question of hope for myself as a South African citizen.
And what I find really interesting is how like contemporaneous books kind of deal with the same kinds of things in the same kinds of ways. So yesterday I was speaking to Gugulethu Mhlungu, who's just launched a really fascinating book that ponders equality called You've Struck a Rock, and looking at women in politics, all forms of different politics, but whereas her book centrally concerns itself with equality, yours centrally concerns itself with violence, but you're both looking at both at the same time, always. This idea of equality, this idea of violence, this idea of a country that has such a progressive constitution, but where the material realities fail to reflect that, and then what that has meant historically and for the present. And what I find fascinating about both of your books is that at the end of her book, she turns to imagination and to joy, and speaks about the fact that she's always speaking about that at the same time in the book. And I found it interesting that your book at the end turns to hope. There's just something really fascinating about dealing with that which is really, really difficult, and saying, and still we must hope, and still we endure, and still we imagine anew. And the way that you think about hope, again, is fascinating, because you're thinking about hope as not something we individually have, or something that is about a feeling, but as something that is relational. Can you tease that out a bit more?
Yeah. So in the book, I talk about hope as it's understood in psychoanalytic theory in different ways. And as you say, Danny, I do insist on treating hope as something that exists between us. For example, between the rulers of our country and us as the ruled. But I do acknowledge that hope is a psychological experience. Yes, it's a relational experience, but it's also a psychological experience. It is private in a sense that we do have private hopes, individual hopes for our country. But I also argue that we must be very careful of psychologizing hope. If we're going to just psychologize hope, then we're on a hiding to nothing.
Can you talk a bit more about what you mean by psychologizing hope?
If we treat it as a strictly psychological experience, then we are we really aren't doing the work, as it were. I argue that we cannot be hopeful as a nation unless we bring about certain material changes in the life of this country. It's pointless talking about hope for the nation if inequality in post-apartheid South Africa continues to get worse, because then it really is just pie in the sky stuff. It's a kind of idealization, actually. It's a defensive response against worsening inequality, that inequality is getting worse, but I'm hopeful we'll get there eventually. There has to be a material improvement in the lives of the majority of South Africans if hope is to become something worth talking about. In the same breath, I also look at the problem of inequality and what the historical record tells us about how we might address it. And unfortunately, it makes for pretty grim reading. That when it comes to dealing with inequality, if one looks at the history of the human species going right back to the Stone Age, then what has really been very successful in dealing with inequality is a monumental loss of human life. And that obviously is not a solution for our country. And what it means is we've really got our work cut out. Dealing with the material inequality in this country is going to require, where does one even go with that? Because obviously when one looks at different political thinkers, economic thinkers, they will insist, no, my perspective on dealing with inequality is the correct one, right? Big government and control the market. And then, of course, the free marketeers will say, no, that's the worst idea possible. You need to let the market distribute everything according to its invisible hand, right? But the point I make, regardless of what one thinks the economic solution to inequality might be, is that we can't talk about hope in this country unless we deal with material inequality effectively. So although I end off talking about hope, I try to just caution the reader that we mustn't see it in an idealized kind of sense. There's a lot of material work that needs to happen for hope to become a genuine prospect in this country.
And I feel like the predominant way that hope is spoken about is in these kind of abstract idealistic terms, the idea of alive with possibility, a kind of sloganeering, as opposed to a sense of dealing with material conditions and material realities. And as a last question before I open up to everybody else, you end off the book after hope speaking about the golden rule, something that exists as a universal idea in moral theories and in ethical theories, and as something that tells us about what is right action and right inaction. Can you speak about that a bit more?
So I suppose that's my psychologist solution for material inequality, that the golden rule is possibly the only universal ethical rule that our species has ever come up with, across time, across space.
Can you just map out what it is?
And what the golden rule is, treat others as you want to be treated, and do not treat others as you do not want to be treated. In other words, recognize the humanity of the person that you happen to be with in a given moment. Treat them respectfully, and not just in a psychological sense, but in a material sense. Be alert to the question of dignity in your interactions with people. Don't subject people to treatment that you wouldn't want yourself to be subjected to. It sounds like a very trite thing, right? That we've known this, perhaps our parents even have told us this, right? I mean, since we were small. But the golden rule remains incredibly elusive. It's a very simple formula, but it's an incredibly difficult thing to practice, actually. And I suggest in the book that at least as far as my contribution to, as a psychologist is concerned, the promise of the golden rule as a respectful and dignified way of relating with the people in our lives, the potential of that rule is significant.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to say thank you for listening so attentively. I felt the very active attention. And right now I want to open up just if anybody has any questions that you'd like to phrase about the book, or even questions about what we've spoken about so far. Is there anyone? Thank you.
Evening, everybody, and my name is Zamo, and thank you very much both for a really great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
It's a great advert for the book. So I need to credential myself a little bit because of everything that I'm going to say. So I, like Wahbie, am a psychologist and a senior psychotherapist at Tara, teaching and training, and I'm also a training analyst. And I want to make a comment with a question, though I first want to begin by outing Wahbie, because I was at a conference with him a couple of years ago, and he was sitting at, there was an audience of psychoanalytic psychologists and psychoanalysts, and he opened by saying, I know nothing about psychoanalysis. I'm not like you psychoanalysts there. And then he goes and he writes a book about envy, hope, and he elucidates it in such a clear psychoanalytic way, which is about depth. It is about appreciating what it is that we can control and what it is that we cannot control. It is about really positioning our nation, not just in its implication today where we find ourselves, but really where we come from. So my first outing is a challenge to you, Wahbie, that apparently you're very psychoanalytic in your thinking. And I think that you should come back to us and apologize. And I'll tell you why else. Because should there be any psychology students, what you do so very well is debunk the idea that psychologists and psychoanalysts in particular are always just focused on the intrapsychic as if there is no absolute relation to the other and to its context. And in fact, that's exactly what psychoanalytic thinking is. And you've shown it. You really have written a testimony to that. And as we know, in fact, Freud was very political in very many ways. So bear with me, that was just my opening, my preamble.
It was a great preamble.
Thank you. What I did want to say to you is to put to you something which is very difficult to grapple with, and I hope you can help, and already I can hear you've helped with that. When you speak about hate, and the fact that hate is almost pervasive, it's ubiquitous, it sounds like you're saying it's nascent almost, though maybe, that's just Freud. What I really like is your conceptualization that it will be passed on and on and on and on, as you really, you said it tonight. One cannot bear to be hated or shamed, and so they do it to the other. And I've been in search of, and I understand that concomitance and, have looked at it in different ways. So in a contemporary South Africa, we can argue that the xenophobic attacks are black foreign nationals bearing the hate unprocessed by black nationals, and I'm really reducing it, kind of really trying to deal with the hate that they face from apartheid, white South Africa, managing their hate from Britain, and I'm obviously borrowing Helene Opperman Lewis's stuff here around how apartheid is a British and we can really follow it on around its intergenerational inheritance, a poison chalice. Now, if we are to find hope, I have a question for you. How do we deal with it so that there does not need to be another by virtue of a victim of crime or by virtue of a group of people? How do we deal with it so that we do not have to find that other in order to continue this lineage, this intergenerational trauma, if we are to have hope? And I'm asking you an impossible question, though you've done well so far, if you excuse my... and I'm really curious about your comments on that question.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Samo, and thanks for coming out tonight. It's great to see you here after, I think it's been more than 2 years. I think that the trauma of colonialism and apartheid, which is hundreds of years in the making, is not going to go away anywhere anytime soon. And I think we have to get to a point where we acknowledge that there aren't going to be any easy solutions. And one of the comments I make in the closing chapter is that we can't get rid of our historical trauma. At least I don't believe we can. I don't think that we can get our national psyche to a point where the trauma is no longer there. I think that the best we can hope for is to change how we relate to our trauma. In other words, and I write this in the closing page of the book, instead of being determined, instead of being lived by our trauma, we learn to live with it. We learn to live with it in a way where we're not acting it out all the time against our fellow South Africans. The best that we can hope for is to not have to, and this is the very last sentence of the book, the best we can hope for is to not have to carry our trauma on our backs, but to be able to walk alongside it. And the only, and I'm talking as a psychologist now, the only way we can do that is to understand our trauma, is to make conscious the unconscious. But I use that in a very sort of conditional kind of way, because if it's unconscious, it's unconscious, right? How do you make the unconscious conscious? But unless we understand the history of trauma and of pain that still plays itself out in the present, we're continually going to repeat, right? In that compulsive way, which of course Freud talks about, that when you don't have a handle on your stuff, if you will, you carry on doing the same thing over and over again. And again, that's not to say that if you understand something, that you're not going to act it out anymore. And that's why, as psychologists, we talk about working something through, right? That we're going to continue to do these things to each other over and over and over again. But unfortunately, there is no way to short-circuit this process. The best we can do is to try to understand our past, and what that means is having honest conversations with each other. Honest conversations with each other, and not running away from each other in those moments of meeting. That requires courage, though. That requires real courage to be able to be with someone in a way where you open yourself up. You open yourself up in a way where you express your vulnerability, or you take you cop abuse, you take an attack, right? It requires real courage to be able to tolerate that and to stay for that kind of journey that I believe our nation is on. Most people will say that the TRC perhaps brought closure for some South Africans, but for many it left more questions than it provided answers. And that's sort of my way of saying that the business of the past is not past. It's still present, it's still with us, and if we're going to confront that past with each other courageously, and to stay the course with each other rather than running for the hills, that gives us the chance to get a handle on this political unconscious that just acts out all the time. Zamo, I hope that goes some way to answering your question.
The next question.
I am not worthy. It's very interesting. I assume that this is a work of non-fiction, sir. Creative non-fiction. Okay. Just having published a novel about these things, but in a very sort of satirical, I'm a Jewish person, so I kind of can use my own culture as an example, and having had 21 years of psychoanalysis. It's very interesting. So it's just a comment from me to you across a room full of strangers. I'm looking into almost the memoir of my arrival here as a white, young Jewish South African at the age of 14 who knew nothing. And I'm actually investigating on a psycho-emotional, literary level, if you like, that experience. And I'd just like to thank you for writing this book at this moment, because it gives me the courage, exactly the courage to write that truth, if you want to call it that, even though it is fiction, to my part in the story, my part in the struggle of my own personal, universal, psychosocial, political, unconscious way. A ping pong ball that is held underwater, when it is let loose, spins to the surface, pops to the surface. And that is what we've been repressing. And I don't know if we start a new TRC, or if writers can actually, you know, of all cultural backgrounds, of all sufferances, because both of us on both sides of the bars suffered this, and engage in some way. I salute your work. I want to read it from cover to cover, and you inspire me to do my work too. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Do we have one last question I'll take?
Hi, good evening. Congratulations, awesome interview. Danny, you've done such a good job. Now I feel like I know the whole book. I don't need to read it anymore.
Please read the book. Thank you.
I love this idea of understanding as a route to healing, and the paradox of knowing that you have to know yourself, and yet we may not ever be able to get there. So really powerful stuff as for an individual as well. My question is about at the global level now. If we connect this trauma as South Africans that we've been through, and then we look at the trauma that the world is going through, I'm also curious about your solution being about respecting the other and multiculturalism and so on. One of the saddest things that I felt with Brexit and the Trump phenomenon was my whole South African resolution to apartheid being, the Rainbow Nation. I saw it coming to a complete destruction with the way the world is going. I really wrestled with this with Trump's election. I couldn't believe that 40% of the U.S. voted for that kind of narrow vision. It was so against what we've been telling ourselves as South Africans. The solution is respect and multiculturalism and so on. So it looks like multiculturalism is losing steam globally, and yet you calling to that as the solution to our trauma. Having written this book and looking at the global scene, what's your take on where the world is going? China, Brexit, the Trump phenomenon, Israel, Syria. It looks the scariest scenario of immense violence at the global level looks like now a horrible possibility. And then as a funny beam of hope, we all go through this collective COVID experience, and suddenly there's an opportunity to connect as humans again. I wonder if you could just tie that in as well. How does COVID change your analysis? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Some big questions there, and I certainly can't pretend that I'm going to answer them in any comprehensive way. But maybe I can just point out some strands that might be useful to think about. As for the question of COVID, it's really interesting times, as the Chinese would say. And I think it really underscores the point that we are fundamentally relational beings. When one looks at the psychological distress that people are under in COVID conditions, where they're not able to go around doing their normal social rounds, if you will. They're not allowed to give expression to this relational nature. Then it really shows. I think COVID times really shows up the the relevance of this idea of human beings being fundamentally relational, as being constituted through their relationships with other people. And when those relationships get disrupted, there's real psychological fallout. As for the question about global politics, I sort of think of global politics nowadays in terms of identity politics, which I think is very much the predominant form of politics in our times. And when I think of identity politics, for me, it really comes down to the question of recognition. Recognition, respect, and dignity. So identity politics is profoundly psychological, but we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that it's only psychological. That in other words, what lies behind this psychology of recognition and respect and dignity are very real material inequalities in people's lives. And I think it's so important that when we talk identity politics, that we keep, again, the psychological in conversation with the social, the psychological in conversation with the material, lest we do one at the expense of the other. So that's my reading of global politics right now, that the question of recognition, of respect, of dignity, I don't want to say it's a zeitgeist thing. I mean, that's a bit of a cop-out. But it's a question that is very salient in the world right now.
And I think in working towards closing, what this book offers and what I think is really productive is I'm repeatedly thinking through the idea that we, as human beings, are kind of trained into the move from question to answer. And that requirement of the answer, and besides the idea of the golden thread, which we can discourse, disagree with, debate, unpack, I think the value of this book is it offers one kind of unpacking and mapping of a question. Why is South Africa the way it is today? And why are we such a violent society? And in that mapping, there are many different pathways that we can go on as we try to make sense of our own role in it, and how we move forward individually, but with relationality in mind. And I'd like to just say thank you to Wahbie for a really, really fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Danny, for
I
a
will
great
be mailing
discussion.
you more questions. Just because I'm personally very fascinated by the book. I would ask that you please purchase this book, buy one for someone else as well, share the book, loan it out to people. It's a fascinating book, and I think we'll be speaking about it for a while longer. Thank you to the Commune and Melinda Ferguson Books for hosting us, and to all of you for being so deeply attentive, so present. I thank you too. And for everybody who's on the live stream as well, thank you for tuning in. Good night, everyone.
I have, just at the end, because I've been looking at the live stream, Charity wrote that I appreciate Wahbie's honesty, humility, and the vulnerability with which he engaged in these discussions. I salute his work and feel very inspired by his work. So on behalf of everyone who is here and those who are at home, thank you both so much. Today marks the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune, which our own commune is named after. And we are very dedicated to the labor of creating spaces where we can have intellectual curiosity, look at psychoanalysis as part of culture, as part of political theory. So thank you both so much, and thank you everyone who came through. Good night.
Thanks
Thank
very
you,
much.
Melinda.